Going live, and we're live. Hey guys, welcome back. Today I have with me Noah and Landon. We're going over the second half of Notes from Underground, the apropos of the wet snow. Uh, so I guess go ahead, guys. Where do you guys want to start?
Yeah, so I guess I just want to begin with a general synopsis of the piece. Starting at part two, he is kind of overviewing his life at his younger years. Um, and he's 24 and he's working in an office in a job that, is kind of mundane to him. He's kind of in like like below average place in life. Financially speaking and just like socially speaking, I guess, as well. And so pretty much he's talking about this instance where he's in a bar that he stumbled into because he saw someone thrown out of a window, and that like kind of it just excited him, and so he wanted to go in here and to like be a part of this, I don't know, this aggressive energy, this I guess a better way of putting it would be vital energy. Um, and yeah, he meets this officer who like kind of just pushes him to the side, like moves him out of the way of where he was like standing, and like puts him in another place. But he does it like very, as though he does it so insignificant. He feels so insignificant in that he'd wish that he had rather just fought the officer and had him thrown out the window rather than just been regarded as like nothing. Um, and so he kind of gets into this play of how he kind of goes into this like this crazed like obsession with watching this officer throughout his day. He follows him around and he like tries to build up the courage in him to bump into this, to not move out of the way of the officer when he's walking towards him, kind of prove a point of dignity. Um, and
Well, what's
it,
interesting is he does that over the course of like 2 years. So
yes,
he literally obsesses over this for like 2 years to build up the courage to bump into the guy like that.
yeah, and then eventually, yeah, uh, eventually he bumps into the man, um, and again it was like it wasn't a, to the officer, it wasn't a point of anything. I mean, you think about it, like psychologically speaking, you have on one hand someone who was in a bar 2 years ago, probably doesn't even remember the night, and left and went about the rest of his life, whereas you have a man who is altered, um, in like his perceptions of like who he was as a man and like what his value meant, and in this one instant you have on the one hand someone who regards it as someone just bumping into him and he goes about his life, and on the other you have a man who feels like he's retrieved, um, some great form of dignity for himself. And it's just it kind of is just like an introduction to like what he goes on later regarding and just kind of his obsession, I guess, with how others perceive him. Kind of his where he's obsessed with where he stands among others in terms of, um, power, I guess, and his like power relations to others. Like he'll go about this with, the friends of his colleagues that he goes out to dinner with. Um, and yeah, so you have a man who is he's burdened with this feeling of inferiority and insignificance, and so he's so desperate to like prove himself. Um, it's quite a it's quite sad when you think about it.
Yeah, it to me it seemed like an obsession with like a hierarchy. And I think what Dostoevsky was getting at was as we kind of like like scientifically begin to think of ourselves as like hyper rational animals. Like he mentions in the first part how like science will tell us that we evolved from apes. But like at the same time, like we want to conquer that, um that like that like that striving for dominance. We tend to like fall back into that the more segregated we get from that, psychologically speaking. Like that animal instinct to be at the top of the hierarchy and to not physically fight for dominance, but linguistically.
Mm. Which, speaking of that, I find it really funny because he wrote an expose about the officer and sent it into a paper, and then got upset because they didn't publish it. Which I thought
No,
that was
he
pretty
said
funny.
that style of writing just wasn't in at the time, and that's why it didn't get published.
Yeah. I just thought that was funny because it was such an insignificant thing.
Yeah.
He just blew it way out of proportion. But it
Well,
was,
that was
well, I can kind of understand to a degree. I mean, not to the degree at which he followed through with it, but I can understand why you would be annoyed if someone is just like so condescending that they just like pick you up and like move you out of the way and just ignore you and don't even say like sorry or anything. They just like move you and then keep going. Um, I can kind
that
of
was like
understand.
the most like interaction he had had with someone for a while. Like he was so
Mhm.
segregated in his little corner. Like that was like the first human interaction he had had, and that's with someone who's on like a higher level of society. Like
Mhm.
it's an authority figure that interacted with him and then didn't even notice him.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
and he even has problems like communicating with people at his social status level because like he said that his coworkers, he would play this game where he would try and hold eye contact as long as possible, but he would always be the one to drop his gaze first. He would never win. Um, and like he struggled to talk to people. He didn't like the people around him because he thought that they were like stupid. Um,
Yeah,
like
he talks about that, and I think it's the first part here.
yeah,
He talks about how I'm looking through my notes here, but essentially he regards himself with like a certain inferiority to others. He fears like that's how others perceive him, but he's also angered at the fact that the people who he actually sees as inferior, they don't worry about those things, and so he's like
mm,
angered that they don't see themselves um, in their
mm.
stupidity. Um,
Well, so I guess he considers himself like physically inferior, but mentally, I think he thinks he's superior.
yeah,
Um, and this, I think, is where his like neuroticism comes in. He's incredibly neurotic.
he said in the first part he says that every decent man of our time is and is bound to be a coward and a slave. If he shows courage in one situation, he'll be bound to step down against something else.
I
Um,
actually wrote down that exact same quote.
yeah, it's interesting. Like, why did you write it down? What made you think
I
of?
I just thought it like really stood out.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it it's interesting because like he to me it kind of says that it's something along the lines of what Nietzsche says, which is like if you're kind of a good person, you're gonna just fall for what the crowd tells you to do, and in that sense, you kind of follow the slave morality. Um, and so this narrator kind of looks down on these people and says that oh, they're just good people, um, and they're effectively slaves.
Hmm. Well, I guess I read it. I guess a bit differently. I see what you're saying there. Um, I guess what I read it as is him. I feel like he's kind of identifying with like being a decent man, like a good man. But the reason why he's a coward and a slave is because I think he sees being good as being smart, as being intelligible and like intellectual. And with anyone intellectual, highly intellectual, they're going to come against contradictions. I mean, this man is a like he is called a paradoxalist at the end of the book because he comes up he like turns on himself so much that
Mhm.
he he can't. It's almost like the thing where he has so much internal analysis that he fears to act.
Mm.
So that was like the way in which I read it. But yours was also I can understand what you were saying as well.
No, I see what you're saying because I did have a note after that because he says decent men will always find something to be upset over. Or that's a paraphrase of what he was saying.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it does make sense that he would kind of point to himself as a decent man because he always sees something wrong in what he's doing or what
Yeah,
other people are doing.
yeah. Because you can, I mean, if you're smart enough, you can always find something wrong with something.
Hmm.
So it, it's kind of like a burden.
Yeah, which is actually something he says later on, I think in chapter 8. Um, he says that people count their griefs more than they count their happinesses. And if
Mhm.
they were to count them fairly, they would realize just how much they actually have.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Which
Well, I
is,
think it's kind of like a symptom of boredom. Like if you're like if someone as smart as him doesn't really have like a job to be doing that is intellectually taxing, he can just kind of uh, like waste away and just be kind of like a hamster in a wheel. Just his mind's just spinning and spinning and spinning.
mhm. which which that is exactly the case because he did drop from like a high-ranking intellectual job to a low-ranking kind of service job.
Hmm.
Um, it's interesting because that could go both ways though. Because if you see how that played out with like Albert Einstein, for example, he was a very, very intelligent man, and he took a uh, very kind of simple-minded job intentionally so that he would have time to focus on his work. Um, but I guess it really depends on if you have an aim,
Yeah.
which this narrator doesn't really seem to have an aim.
Yeah. See,
So,
I think his aim would be to kind of point out the faults in others and the fact they don't analyze enough. They don't. Um, he's almost like mad at people for not being as smart as he is. It's like
mhm,
it's
Yeah,
interesting.
I think like that's kind of like a facade he's putting on, but in reality, he really just wants to be at, like social stability. Like he wants to be higher up in the
mhm,
ranks of society and to have um to have friends and everything like that.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I don't know if it's necessarily that he's mad that other people aren't intelligent. I think that he's mad because he thinks it's unfair that he has to deal with all of these problems because of his intelligence.
Mhm.
So he's effectively in constant anguish because he's always thinking about the negative. He's always offended by something. He's always upset. Um, and he's mad at other people because they're not always upset. And that's a problem that he has to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. What you said before, Landon, it kind of in chapter or part four, it kind of backs up what you said because I quote it says, "I love true comradeship on an equal footing," and he's talking about went to the dinner table with um, Sverkov and the others, and he merely wants to demonstrate his intellect in order to like have them see him as an equal. Um, so yeah, you're right. He wants that stability through his intellect, and he wants
Mhm.
as anyone does, they want. recognition for their better qualities, I guess. And
Mm.
he believes his better qualities is his intellect, when it also is his worst qualities.
Yeah, he wants intellectual dominance, and he's an intellectual bully because of that, like a little kid, you know.
Yeah,
Well, he's like the other thing that I find interesting is he's extremely romantic, not in like the kind of like love sense, but
yeah,
in the like he romanticizes everything.
yeah,
So with the whole friendship thing, um, I think it was with the officer, for example, he thought about like he would fight the officer and then they would become best friends because the officer would come to him and like apologize and beg for his friendship and blah blah blah, and then eventually they would become best pals and they would like it's a very romantic
Mhm.
idea that
yeah. He does the same thing with Verkov, because after they leave dinner, he wants to go and slap him,
mm,
and he like envisions this like impending duel, um, where they like where he and Zverkov will duel, and like they'll reconcile
mhm.
afterwards. It's very funny.
When he does the same thing with Lisa, he I think it's early chapter 9, he says, or he's thinking to himself, like, if she comes to my house, then I will rescue her and I will teach her and I will make her a better person. And then as her teacher, she will start to love me. And instead of saying something to her, I will just let her go through it. And then eventually she'll come to me with her love. And I'll say, well, I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to pressure you into it. And then we'll get married and have kids and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's very like, he's an incredibly romantic person.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it's like it's so romantic and abstract that it's like separate from the way life actually works, which is what I think Dostoevsky was really trying to get at. Was he's so separated from society and so psychologically um, incapable of like functioning like with real people, um, that like he concocts these crazy stories that just like they have no basis in reality. He quotes that at like the very end. I think I don't remember the exact quote, but he just um, he kind of says that um, like his philosophy and like the books he read don't really have any basis in reality.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting because like everyone has the tendency to do this a little bit. I mean, I know I can definitely think of times where someone has done something to me and I will just go off on a tangent and just like start following that and wind up somewhere completely separate from where I was when it all started.
yeah.
Um, so
I think
there's that tendency to do that.
you can most feel that. At least I can, with like seeing a beautiful girl. Like a lot of guys will have that problem where they like they'll romanticize it to where they don't even know this person, and they envision you know their life for the next like 5 years or something. And it's like I don't know, yeah, it's interesting, like when you reflect it on yourself, the his his romanticizing of just all these like seemingly arbitrary events in his life.
Mm,
But I think also part of that stems from the fact that he has no like he has no higher meaning, like you said. And so
mm,
when you don't have higher meaning, it's going to transfer into somewhere else in your life, and it'll like express itself in things that are otherwise arbitrary.
mhm. Um, well, it's interesting because he also, so on the topic of like romantics,
Mm-hmm.
he says that Russia has no true romantics like the French or the Germans, and that the Russian romantic has an air of practicality to him.
Yes.
Um, he says that they're seemingly adapted to the mundanity of modern life. Um, I thought that was really interesting because in a way he really embodies that
Mm-hmm.
because like the way I picture like a French or German romantic kind of as opposed to him would be almost like a healthy way of doing it. It's like, yeah, these thoughts come up, but they don't become like an obsession. Um, it's almost that it becomes an obsession because his life is so mundane.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's
I have a quote from like when he's talking about the Russian and the French and the German romantic, where he uh he says that the Russian romantic is the greatest fraud of all our frauds. Um, and he also says that the Russian romantic sees everything and sees it often far more clearly than our most positive, practical minds. So yeah, it's almost like the Russian romantic is more honest, but perhaps that honesty isn't isn't necessarily beneficial to the person because he says um, than our most positive, practical minds. So
Mm,
it's kind of like that idea that knowing knowledge isn't always a good thing to have. Um, like knowing too much can be a problem. It's just, but it was like an interest. It was hard to hash out this passage because I I don't know. I couldn't tell if he was like esteeming the Russian romantic above the French and German, or he was like critiquing the Russian romantic.
mm. In my opinion, it felt like more of a critique. Um, but in all honesty, I'm not really sure. I mean, it felt like a very kind of negative description of the Russian romantic,
Mm-hmm.
but that could just be because he's such a negative person. That's just the way it comes off.
Yeah. You have any thoughts on that, Landon?
um just the quote that comes to mind is he's talked about how cunning goes hand in hand with feeling or something along those lines, and that like there seems to be like if we're analyzing him psychologically, it seems to be like a disconnect between his thinking faculties and his emotions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That Russian romanticism is kind of his desire to get more in tune with his emotions, instead of just like intellectually mulling things over in his little corner.
Hmm. Well, and he says, kind of related to that, he says that the Russian romantics wouldn't lift a finger for their ideals, even though they would hold them with extreme reverence. And you can kind of see this embodied in him, where he walks past the officer for like months, trying to build up the courage to bump into him, but never actually does it. And then it
Yeah,
finally takes him like closing his eyes and just like keep going to like to finally do it.
Yeah.
yeah, and like you guys said, he did it all in the name of friendship.
Exactly. And then the officer moved away. Oh
Yeah.
man, that was so
That's
funny.
great. Yeah, the I think my favorite part of this part two was the dinner. Like it just like blew my mind, how psychologically adept Dostoevsky is at like framing um, this interaction over dinner. It was, if we want to move on to that, I'm sure you guys have a lot of notes on that too.
Yeah, we
Well,
can.
before
Or
we go there, I wanted to uh, talk about what he says in part two. He talks about the what he calls the lofty and beautiful. So this is kind of like his idea
mm,
of his romanticizing of things and um, kind of his like his escape from reality into something like dreams because um, he says that dreams like satisfied his desire for the lofty and beautiful. Um, and he
mm,
also says that his escapes into the lofty and beautiful were so. Is a note that I have. His escapes into the lofty and beautiful were so bountiful that he never felt the need to put those visions into practice. Um,
Mm.
he says that they always ended most satisfactory in a lazy and ecstatic transition into the realm of art. Um,
Hmm.
Yeah. He said it was stuff like the Pope going to, was it Brazil? Um, and stuff like that. It was just like incredibly strange things that were just kind of like out there.
yeah,
That's kind of like Apollo and the Birth of Tragedy.
yeah. I was trying to because he talks
Mm.
about how it dissolved or how it kind of transitioned to art, and so I was trying to like reconcile that with what we talked about previously.
Mm.
And I don't know, just based on the phrasing of it, it's almost yeah, because it's like satisfactory. Yeah, it's almost like an Apolline um, quality of vision that
Mm.
it gives itself its own domain. Like that's why it goes into art, and so it suffices for him. Um, but not they're not even practical visions. He says they're just like visions of beauty. So they're like it kind of shows how art kind of gives its own domain as opposed to just being something used um, for like a sake of practicality, whatever that means. I don't necessarily know how art can be something practical, other than the fact that it's like the beauty of it helps to expand, like move a country or a kingdom forward.
Mm.
But yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah. I did have one other thing from chapter 2 that
Mhm.
I thought was really funny. So he brings up the idea that there are times that he wants to go be with other people, but the only person that he wants to be around is Anton, which is his boss.
Mhm.
And so, but his boss only has like one day, Tuesday, a week that he can actually go visit him. So he says that he has to embrace the whole of mankind on Tuesdays,
Yeah,
which I thought was funny.
that was in the end of two, right?
Yeah, so that was chapter 2. For me, it was on page 59.
Okay.
Let me see if I can't find. Yeah. I needed in. Sorry. Uh, but even to him I used to go only when such a spell came, and my dreams had reached such happiness that I needed, instantly and infallibly, to embrace people and the whole of mankind, for which I had to have available at least one really existing person. Anton and Antonich,
Mhm.
however, could only be visited on Tuesdays, his day, and consequently my need to embrace the whole of mankind always had to be adjusted to a Tuesday.
That
Yeah,
sounds like a Zarathustrian messianic complex to me. Is he's gonna come down from the mountain with everything he's learned and embrace all of mankind.
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
and also
it's weird because like Zarathustra, it kind of felt like healthy-ish. This feels
Mm.
completely unhealthy. Um,
Well, he thinks he's smarter than he is. Like if he was like genuinely as intelligent as he thinks he is, I
mhm,
think it could be like that. But he's not. He's
mm,
smart, not like Messiah smart. You know.
yeah.
mhm,
Well, I think something too that would be different from Zarathustra is that this man here, which is, and this goes to like something I was learning about Nietzsche, reading about Nietzsche yesterday, um, because I saw James's video regarding like Nietzsche's shadow diagnosis, the video he posted the other day,
mhm,
and so it got me interested in like what were Nietzsche's ideas of love, and it seems like Nietzsche had ideas of like he had like he esteemed love, and he said that like love there's no like obvious. Well, there's I forgot how he phrases it, but where this man's coming from, is definitely not a place of love. He wants to. He has like a feeling of superiority, and he doesn't wish to bestow knowledge upon others or wisdom upon others
Mm,
um, for the sake of like bettering the people around him.
mm.
Um, but he sees them as like it's something he has to tolerate, um,
Well, and
and something
so his
better.
his embracing of mankind is something selfish. It's to fulfill a need. For Zarathustra, like the embracing of humanity was exactly like you're saying. It's something out of love. It's to produce the Superman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for the narrator here, it's entirely uh, it's just a desire that popped into his head that he needs to fulfill, and in that sense, it's very selfish.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess I was talking more along the lines of like kind of that like inflation that's so obvious. He calls himself an egoist, and you see him kind of fluctuate between praising his intellect and how high he feels himself superior to people, and then calling himself like a worm. And you just see this kind of uh, he plummets to the heights and then drops down as he confronts man and sees that he's not everything that his ego wants to be.
Hmm.
You could also even think of that as um, someone who can see the best in something can see the worst in something. So
Mm.
like the idea that like a tree that goes into heaven has its roots in hell.
Yeah.
Um, in order to like see the best, he's so like because he fluctuates to these like these tops of inflation, he's able to go down into isolation so like deeply than anyone else. Um,
Well, and
it's
it's
yeah.
to me it's interesting because like I don't really see so I can definitely see like Nietzsche or Zarathustra or someone like that as like a tree that has to have deeper roots in order to grow taller. Like I see that. To me, I see the narrator as a tree that's all root. So it's
Mm.
like a very short tree that's all root. So it's a lot of tree, don't get me wrong. There's a
Yeah.
lot there, but it's all underneath the surface.
It's all
It's
underground,
all
man.
underground, exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point actually.
um, because that is actually a quote from Nietzsche. Um, I think in the 13th chapter. I forget what it's called. It's like the disciple and the tree on the hill, and he says that if a tree is to grow lofty and tall, its roots must drive deeper down into the evil. Um, but yeah, to me that's funny how that relates. It all connects in somehow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Um,
but we're did you have anything? That's pretty much all I had left on part two. Uh,
Same.
so what were you going to say? What were you interested in part three, Landon? I know you wanted to go into something earlier.
Well, so it's I don't know, like it was just so like I wish I could have been like a fly on the wall seeing this whole interaction between him and his old high school friends going like it was just I don't know, there was something about it that was just so intriguing to me. I was This video popped up in my YouTube feed, and it was this guy like psychologically analyzing a podcast with the comedian Bill Burr and the comedian Theo Vaughn,
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
where like Bill Burr just kind of like goes in and just like dominates this podcast. And the guy was just like going into all these like psychology tactics that Bill Burr was using to just the guy narrating it said like reach into Theo Vaughn's psyche and just take hold of him. And it was interesting like reading this after reading the 48 Laws of Power, where you can kind of walk in, and if someone's not um, prepared for it, you can just like dominate the conversation, and everyone will be just gripped on your every word, and you'll have complete control over people using these psychological tactics. And it seems like that's what he was attempting to do, but he completely like overestimated himself and failed, and then was just like destroyed by the failure. And it was just like he just like just starts like falling apart the whole way through until people are essentially just ignoring him, which, as we spoke about last week, is his worst fear. He wants to be hated, but he's not even worthy of being hated. He's just ignored.
Yeah. He says he paces back and forth for 2 hours, and the only person that pays attention to him is the waiter.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, man.
The waiter gives him this terrified, like just staring at him with this terrified look.
Exactly.
Yeah. He's like so psychologically childish. It was so like beautifully constructed by Dostoevsky to like make this like hyper intellectual person who has like the emotional maturity of a toddler, and just how that would enact out in a social situation with people from his high school.
Well, I think before they even have the dinner, I think it's important to recognize how he come to be invited, because when he goes to see Simonov, because he couldn't see Anton because it was Thursday, but he was feeling so, he had like a surge of wanting to acquaint wanting to see his old acquaintance, and even though he didn't necessarily like him, but he just he wanted the I guess the interaction. And Simonov and I forgot the two other names, but they're also
Perfetchkin and
Perfetchkin, and the other one was
Trudolubov.
Yeah, and it was these three. They were talking about preparing a dinner party for Zverkov, and the author detests Zverkov, especially in school, because he was so, quote, pretty and high spirited. So you can think of Zverkov as being like this sort of like naive master type, where he's just like naturally gifted and is naturally dominant. And the author hates him, I guess, because he's like a failure of intellect, because he was natural and so good at what he did. He didn't have to really work for anything that he had. He resents him for that, because he didn't have to earn it. And so, anyways, he invites himself to the dinner, and then he knows that he's not like feeling invited, but he goes out of spite. And so already here we kind of see like a flaw, and I guess his general motive to want to go. He again wants to pedestalize himself, and wants to get himself like above his comrades.
Well, that's the thing, is he invited himself. Like he didn't. They didn't offer for him to go. He was like, "Oh, and what about me? Like, why are you not saying my money?"
Yeah.
And then he like tortured himself for having invited himself, and then goes, "No, I'll go out of spite." Like, it's, I don't know. It's something about it was just so incredibly entertaining, and it was like such a like a good look into the way social situations tend to run, and having someone who's isolated and completely unadapted to social norms, who has like this need to pedestalize, like you said, Noah, is very well written.
Yeah. And he also, at the end of chapter 3, he like again has that romanticizing of winning over his schoolmates from Zverkov, and kind of demonstrating his superiority on an intellectual level. He even talks about how when they were in school, as he became smarter, as he like became the best student, they stopped teasing him, the author, but there was still like a hostility. So it's like they they like felt that he had a certain power, but they didn't respect him for his power. It's like
Mm,
because there was something. It was just, I guess, his interior motive to want to be
Mhm.
better than them. It wasn't like
mm,
noble. It was, I want to be better than you, and I want to dominate you.
mm,
Um, but it's just like it's very, um, very faulty and very like faulty at the foundations, I guess.
Well, I think the intellect is like very rarely like a good attribute from society. Like you want someone to be competent, but when they're smart in the way that this guy is smart, it's like it's resented. And I think he resents the fact that it's resented by especially the fact that it was resented in high school.
mm,
Well, this other person who was socially competent turned out to be competent in his career as well, and
mm,
went on to be highly esteemed while he plummeted into the depths.
mm. Which I find really funny because Zerkov. So in high school, he's the narrator says that he had like insulted Zerkov, and Zerkov didn't even catch it and just laughed it off. And then later on, Zerkov like insulted him and like multiple times, and didn't even do it like in a mean way. He just did it in a way that offended the narrator. And then that's kind of mirrored later on during the dinner, where the narrator says like, "Oh, I'm sorry that if I offended you," and Zerkov says, "There's no way that you could offend me. It's not even possible that you could offend me,"
Right.
as
Right.
if to say that like you're so far beneath me that I'm not even gonna give you that power over me, which in
Yeah.
a way is kind of like a healthy development because he goes from like a very naive like not even recognizing that the narrator is insulting him to a place where he recognizes that he's insulting him, but he is just not going to give it uh, the mental power over him. So it's he loses that naivety in a sense,
Yeah.
and that is
It's
actually a healthy development.
yeah. Yeah, it was just interesting to like see like the point that Dostoevsky made, that like even though he's like smart, and at like like in even in high school he was able to read these books that were like above average, and even the teacher started to notice that.
Mm,
Even then, like his like intellectual capacities still resulted in isolation socially.
mm,
Like it didn't help him reach these like the societal heights that he wanted to, and it just,
mm.
I don't
This,
know, it is a
so
good point.
I think it did. So he says that it brought him one friend,
Yeah,
but he regarded that friend as in a sense he kind of regarded that friend as like property. He just wanted to control his friend's soul, and as soon as he gained that control, he was just like, I don't want you anymore.
which is like that's like spot on with someone who's, I don't even know what the word, so, like this kind of archetype of the underground man, you could say, where
Mm,
like they bring someone in who's not as intellectually capable, and probably like emotionally traumatized, and they just latch on and then manipulate them into like being, like you said, their property. And
mm,
then it's, oh, I could do that,
yeah,
go away. It's like a sociopathic move.
Yeah.
exactly.
Part three is kind of telling of a general. It gives you an insight into the kind of relationships you can see develop between someone like Svarkov and someone like the narrator. You can see you can see a relationship because you know people that are just naturally more like socially competent. They may have gifts that they didn't necessarily have to earn, but they were more inclined to succeed, I guess you could say. Whereas there are others who they might have to attend to things more or contend with things on a more intellectual basis because because of their inhibitions in other areas of life.
Mm.
And you can see how like resentment kind of can grow out of that, which is kind of like a prelude to what would happen in the communist revolution.
Mm.
You know, it was kind of it was a resentment of those basically those with more, those with uh, greater life conditions, I guess.
Mm.
Um, and that's another way you could look at this specific chapter.
Mm. Well, and it's funny because he pays for dinner by not paying his manservant,
Mm-hmm.
but then later on during the dinner he says that I'm paying for this with my own money. But in reality that's a lie. He stole the money from his servant effectively.
Hmm.
Um, which he then later on borrows money from Anton to pay back his servant and also Simonov, uh,
Right.
which
No, that was a really good point too, Noah. This that how this kind of like ties into uh, communist utopian ideas in a weird way. That was a good point, and yeah, it's you see that uh, the how that relates to his servant, and it, in my opinion, it seems as though he's keeping his servant around, so at least he's above him, you know.
mm,
Otherwise, he would be at the very bottom. But when he has a
mm,
servant that he's paying, because what poor person has a servant?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and you see this, I think in chapter 8 it was, when he says that his servant is very prideful and like won't beg for his wages and won't do anything more than he has to. And so he decides to punish his servant by not giving him his wages until he asks for his wages. Um, I I don't know. There's just something like super resentful about that.
Yeah.
yeah, he's like, you grovel before me, dude. Bow down, please bow down. You're my even his servant has more self-respect than he can muster.
Mm.
Hilarious. Like that shit was making me laugh out loud, like pretty much the whole chapter of like his servant walking into the room and just like sigh at him. That shit was funny, man.
It's
Just
something.
like standing there with his arm behind his back and his hand on his hip, just staring at him.
Well, this is something. It's something archetypal of the intellect in general, like the dangers of the intellect, I guess. Um, you know, being smart is one thing, but integrating your intelligence with wisdom and ability is another thing. So here you see a man who is incredibly smart, um, but yet it fails to serve him well because he lacks other faculties,
Hmm.
uh, lacks social faculties, and lacks um, he lacks wisdom, I guess.
Hmm.
So
And I think wisdom partially stems from emotions, which is where morality often stems from as well. And I think he's disconnected from um, morality, and that's what
Mm.
Dostoevsky was. That's the idea that Dostoevsky was playing with was as in this time frame as God died and as the scientific materialism started to enter in, this disconnect between your rational faculties and your emotional moral faculty, it starts
Mm.
to, they're way separated, and yeah, you just
Yeah.
kind of see kind of pit you get stuck in if the two aren't if the two don't intermingle
Mm.
properly.
Well, and it's interesting because like along the lines of wisdom, it's like it's the ability to control which thoughts that you give like credence to, which thoughts you respond to. It seems like every thought that pops into his mind, he just gives it all of his attention. He doesn't have that kind of mindfulness to just let a thought go. if it pops into his mind, he has to think it through. Um,
To its end.
exactly, and that's I think that's interesting because I just recently watched a video about like one of the big reasons why people have bad trips on psychedelics, and that was like one of the main things that he talked about was like
Yeah.
if you don't meditate and you aren't mindful and you give credence to every thought that pops into your head, you're gonna have a bad trip because there's a lot of thoughts that will come up while you're on psychedelics. Um, and
Well, it's funny. It's funny that you. I was gonna say it's. Can you guys still hear me? I think
Yeah.
I'm
yeah, we
freezing
can
up
hear
here.
you. We can hear you.
Yeah.
Hello?
Okay. It's just saying my internet connection is a bit
Oh, you
unstable.
froze. You're good. You're good, man.
You can
Um,
see me?
yeah, we
Yeah.
can see you. Hello,
Can you see us?
can you see Noah?
Nope. There we go. There we
Uh,
go.
There we go. Okay.
But I was
So go ahead.
I was just gonna say it was funny that you just brought that up because right before you started talking about psychedelics, I was gonna say, yeah, it probably wouldn't be wise for him to do psilocybin, I would say,
Mm,
because like you said, like one of the prime factors or the like lessons you need to learn before going into like a psychedelic experience is the ability to kind of open monitor things and not
mm,
like pay attention to every single thing that floats through your mind
mm,
because um, it could lead you to bad places.
mm. You have
yeah.
to be able to
I,
let
I
things pass.
Yeah.
yeah. Credence is a really good word, James. Is like how much um like yeah, how much credence do you put on those thoughts? Like how real are those thoughts to you? If
Mm,
they're too real, then yeah, shit's gonna get dark quick. And yeah, it's kind of interesting to look at it and the like, cause he's like he talks about like his dreams and like romance, which is kind of like we talked about earlier, like the Apollo aspect of it. It almost seems like a psilocybin trip would be good for this guy to give him the Dionysian aspect of that. Just
I, I'm not entirely sold on that. I think this guy would like run into a frenzy if he were on drugs.
dude,
Yeah.
I'm gonna dose the dude. I'll give him some.
Yeah.
Shit,
Go
that's
find
funny.
an underground man and test this out.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Experiments on the underground man.
Yeah.
Uh, let's see. Oh, so another thing is he prepared for the dinner and he was very much overthinking it. He was thinking about how ragged his clothes were, like what they were gonna say. I mean, he really played into that thought. And then he talked about how his pants had a yellow stain on them, and that would be the first thing that Zerkov would see and think of him as like a poor man,
Hmm.
just straight off the bat.
Yeah. He's like he's able to micro analyze so many details, and he just goes down these rabbit holes of each detail, and
Mm,
um, he just twists himself in these fields of these like torrents of thought
mm,
and like undoes him, yeah, undoes
mm.
him.
Well, and it's interesting because like he's always consciously monitoring his own status and like his position in the status hierarchy,
Yeah.
which feels like a bad thing to do. You kind of want to let your unconscious take care of that. Like you don't want to, and you don't want your ego to manage where you are in the status hierarchy.
Right.
That's not a good idea. Otherwise, you'll uh, fall into the same way of thinking that this guy thinks.
Right.
Well, it almost seems like he could fix a lot of the problems that he has, social, because like
Mm,
it always seems to come back to his financial status and how ashamed he is of that. But he quit his job and just like sits at home all day. So it's like it I don't know, strange to see him not have a job but then be like borrowing money and paying for a servant is just
Mm.
like, of course you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, man. Like you're not trying to move up. You're just sitting at home, like do
Well,
something, you know?
it's like one of those attitudes you'll see in people again who are really smart, who think that the
Mm,
world should come to them because of their intelligence.
Mm.
And intelligence can be a great thing to have, again, but it isn't everything. It certainly isn't everything, because would you rather have, because you don't want someone who's just extremely intellectual with no moral underpinning. Um, like psychopaths, for example, are usually extremely intelligent. Um, so intelligence isn't indicative of like allowing yourself to move up the hierarchy.
Mm.
yeah, that's a good way to tie everything that we've been talking about into each other. Like it's yeah, I think Jordan Peterson talks about this. It's like
Yeah.
the like a very prideful intellect will just assume that things will come. It's like, well, I'm smart, and that's the best trait you can have. So why isn't life laying itself out in front of me so I can walk through smoothly? And it's
Mm.
just not how it works, sadly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
He talks about he had a friend who lived with him for at one point, who was extremely smart, but he worked as a mechanic, um, and he hated it because he thought the job was below him. But because he thought the job was below him, he actually did the job poorly. So he actually was below the job that he did.
Mm,
Um, but anyways, it was a tale of this really smart friend of Jordan Peterson's who ended up taking his own life because of this. Like he couldn't handle this fact that although he was so smart, his like life didn't come easy to him.
Mm.
It is
wow.
yeah, it can be tough. I mean, it's a tough thing to like come to terms with, especially if you're smart,
Mm,
um, because you have to be able to like integrate your intelligence with something beyond that, with morality is like what I keep coming back to, or with wisdom, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it is. It makes sense that you see like drug problems in America, where I'm sure there's like a lot of really smart people that are doing jobs that are below them and they're not being fulfilled at all. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to look at it through the lens of dumbing yourself down just to be able to cope with the mundane reality that is your job. It's
Right.
pretty,
Mm.
and then to not have a job at all would be even like lower down. It's a
Mm.
very intense predicament.
Well, I
But
think
it's
that,
interesting to see that mixed in with like kind of the Western proclivity to search for the easiest way of doing things.
Mhm.
Um, because you kind of have like the intelligent people, they want a challenge and they want that difficulty, but the vast majority of people want things the easiest way they can do them.
right.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and this ties into the question. I think it ties in at least to the question he asks at the very end. Um, which is better, cheap happiness or exalted suffering?
Hmm.
It was like that's the question he asks on the very last page
Right.
of like
mm,
say it differently and say ignorance is bliss. You know, like would it be better to have lower intelligence and an intelligence that meets the capacity of the job that is asked of you,
mm,
and to be surrounded by people of equal intelligence, or would it be better to be hyper intelligent with a job below you and to have people around you that aren't at your capacity? Like
mm.
which one do you want?
Which that's something that he talks about kind of with Lisa. So he talks about the idea that if you have like if you lived in like a stable household with a decent income, you're very likely to be happy because you'll have a family. And he goes into like the whole romanticism of the family and like this scene where there's a mother like breastfeeding her child, and then the child like looks at the father and then like bites the mother's breast, and then they kind of like laugh, and it's a very like romanticized version of the family. Um, and then Lisa actually comes back to him and says, and this is an exact quote: "Honest people have good lives even in poverty," um, which I thought was kind of interesting. It touches on the idea of like the cheap happiness. You can still have a good life.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I think like our more primal software, it urges that family dynamic, and I think that's where like how that's why so many people get tied into that. Like that's why fundamentally a lot of people aren't happy until they have that wife and they have that kid, is because like at the most like base level, that's what we want.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, because the family, like you said, it's so woven into human human nature and our development that
That and job.
yeah, exactly. I mean, those are the two areas where you find the most meaning. People usually find the most meaning in their lives, especially when you have a kid. That's like one of the most meaningful things someone can do. Um, and it's kind of like addressing. It's like it's something similar to like the problem of individuation, because you think of individuation and it is this like noble quest to become like a fuller human being, but with that price you have to you endure suffering, because there's you like take on suffering when you like open yourself to the world, and you try and integrate yourself, you try and balance yourself between like you in like psychological terms, between the ego and, or I guess, consciousness and unconsciousness, like you and like the totality of existence.
Mm.
It's like a question of, well, what's better, to do that, or to to simply live live in such a manner that you're able to find meaning in smaller things. It isn't like, because it isn't necessarily like one way or the other. Isn't You don't know which way is necessarily better than the other, because
Mm.
um, it kind of goes back to ignorance is bliss, because it's like pragmatism almost. Because you're happier or you're better off this way, then perhaps that is truly the better way to go than like killing yourself with so many different aspects you're trying to compile on yourself.
Mm. Well, and he does actually talk about that in the first part. So in the first part, he says, um, the dumb people go with the first explanation, and they don't follow and try and look for a better explanation. And so in that way, they're kind of ignorant. But
Mhm.
in their ignorance, they are justified in their action because they have a reason for their action. While the intelligent people will continue to look for a secondary, tertiary cause, and then try and find out the causes behind those causes, and then that
Right.
will like paralyze them, and they won't be able to act, and then they have no justification for their action. Um, to
Right.
me, that's how that kind of plays out. So in a way, Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky seems to give an answer to that, which is the more simple answer that leaves you with a justified action,
Mhm.
while the narrator kind of struggles with that. Um,
Right. You could see someone, and this makes sense because he's a paradoxalist, like what he says in the end. He knows, like, because he's so smart, he knows the contradictions with each of his actions.
mm,
Um, because like of how intelligent he is, he can always find ways to dig holes out from under himself, and like sweep the carpet out from under himself.
mm,
He Right. It makes it harder to act in the world, because simply because you're thinking too much.
mm,
And a part of your the way you manifest yourself in the world is that you act, you move, and you don't come to like a more holistic life through thinking everything. You have to experience life, and you have to experience certain things that may be wrong, or things that may bring you to error. Um, Perhaps that's the better route than simply trying to think your way through everything in life. It's
Well,
like the fundamental question.
well, and when you do make actions, having the confidence to think that your actions are just.
Right.
Like, if you're constantly overthinking it, you may even act, but if you act and you aren't really confident that what you did was the right choice, then you're just going to nitpick yourself, and it's going to be worse than if you had just left it alone.
Hmm. Right.
Um, let's see. Um,
So we were kind of I guess, part four, talking about the dinner scene. Um,
yeah.
and then the only part I really had noted from that was the fact that he's trying so hard to have his intellect recognize inequality with their status. I guess he wants to be recognized with them. Other than that, I didn't have anything specifically other than after the dinner party.
Yeah. Well, so he did actually challenge Ferfetchkin to a duel, and then
That's right.
instantly back down,
Yeah.
which I thought was funny. Um, and then let's see what else. So he paced for 3 hours. Um, the group left to go to a place called Olympia, which we'll go into in part five. And then the narrator actually asked Simonov for 6 rubles,
Yeah.
which I thought was interesting because, again, he kind of went into how he was proud that he was paying for his own dinner and then asked for money,
Yeah.
um, just contradicting himself.
Yeah.
Do you guys have anything else for part four?
Not in particular.
No, not really. Wait, does part 4 include his meeting with Lisa?
I think that's the beginning of part five.
That's the end of part five, beginning of part six.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
you're right. You're right. So part five. Oh yeah, he got the coach, and he was telling him to go faster
Yeah.
the whole time, and then he was rushing to Olympia, which is a brothel,
Yeah.
where he planned to slap Zerkov in the face to redeem himself. Um, and then he, well, so he imagined that when he did that, that they would get down on their knees and beg him for their friendship, or they would beg him for his friendship.
Right.
And then he kind of thought about that for a minute and was like, okay, that's never going to happen. Um, but he thought, well, I might as well do it anyways and like regain my honor.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out here too that the reason why he wants to get there so fast is because he wants to go. He's trying to out race his intellect. He's trying to outrace his mind. So
Mm,
he has the idea. He's like, all right, I'm gonna go slap him, and then he jumps in a coach. He's trying to get there as fast as possible, so he doesn't think himself out of it.
mm.
So
Which
that's
he
why
almost does.
yeah, exactly. That's why you see him punch the coach driver in the back of the neck.
Yeah, well, he gets out of the coach. He has the coach driver stop, and he
Right.
gets out of the coach and thinks for a minute, and then gets back in the coach, and then does like you said and punches the back of the neck
Yeah.
of the coach driver.
But yeah, he romanticizes having a duel with Zverkov where Zverkov fires and he fires his round into the air, and
Mm,
then they reconcile with each other, and become
become
great
friends.
friends. Something tells me
Man.
that isn't how this turns out.
Yeah. Oh man.
And then
Oh,
so he,
and so he also had the romantic notion that he would like slap him and get into a duel, and then, or no, not even get into a duel. He would like slap them. They would call the police on him. He would go to prison for 15 years,
yes,
and then
Oh,
he would like get out of prison, find Zerkov, and Zerkov would be married and have a kid and all of that, and then he would challenge him to a duel, shoot in the air, and they would become friends.
that was it.
So
Yeah,
it's
that was
it's even more complex than that. He just goes into these incredibly complex romantic ideas,
right.
um, that are
Well,
so lofty.
yeah, he says in that part where you romanticize that. That's actually from a play called Masquerade.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, so it's funny because I think he says it to himself that he knows to himself that that was like a plot from a play where he goes to jail and duels him. So that was really funny.
Oh man.
Find it.
Let's see. So then he arrives at Olympia, um, and none of them were there. Apparently, they had lied to him, and went somewhere else,
Yeah.
which I can't blame them. That was,
dude was
uh,
good, bro.
what's that?
He was wasted. Of course, they lied to him.
Yeah. Um, so he met a pale young girl, um, and then uh, he said that she had a very sullen look on her face,
Hmm.
and that he wouldn't have liked her if she had been smiling. Um, and then he kind of goes into this train of thought where he said that he was happy that he looked repulsive to her, or something along those lines,
Yeah.
um, which I don't really get. That doesn't make sense to me.
It,
Um,
it's just he has like an utter disdain for anything that seems good or anything that seems like beautiful. Um,
yeah.
Mm.
Oh, go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead.
Uh,
This is what I'm saying.
he was at one of his lows, and so he wanted honesty. He felt
Mm.
himself to be in worm mode, and he didn't want someone to esteem him and look up to him, because if they did, he would just resent them as stupid.
Mm. Makes
Yeah, that's
sense.
true. Because yeah, he said like yeah, like you said, he said that it's glad that he's glad uh, he looked repulsive to her.
Yeah.
That it pleases him.
Hmm.
And she goes on to talk about, like, he goes on this whole like spiel about like death and like family, and we spoke on that a little bit,
Hmm.
and then I underlined the part where he for a second he like stopped and he blushes and he goes, oh no, what if she just bursts out laughing at like his monologue. um
Mm.
and that was like that was like a good look into kind of where his head's at. Like he like goes off on this whole like intellectual monologue, and then goes like, oh, like she's probably just gonna laugh, and then she says that he talks like a book.
Mm.
Right.
That
Oh,
was interesting.
that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Well, because he took that in like a very negative way,
Mhm.
almost like an insult.
So
Hmm.
we quoted this earlier, but to kind of delve into it more, I wrote down this quote. It says, "Bluff and real emotion exist so easily side by side." So he's saying that the ability to deceive or to hide real expression, um, it's like there's a fine line between the two. Um,
And what chapter was that in?
chapter 6
Okay,
is when he's having his monologue.
gotcha.
So I guess that would come from, I don't know if it's just his own like neurosis in his inability to kind of express himself truly.
Mm.
Um, Other than that, I can't really think of what else it would be that he means by that.
Well, so I
I guess
don't. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that. Fuck, I kind of forgot what. Like, there seems to be like truth, and that the subjective truth that everyone is explaining, and then kind of like a facade that everyone puts out of like you don't like wear your emotions on your face. You kind of wear a mask.
Mm.
Could that be an interpretation?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I can see that. Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, he goes into his monologue, speaking about um, how she'd be better off with a husband, um, how her like a familial life would bring
Mm.
her true happiness, as opposed to, and then he like goes on to, well, I believe maybe that's in part 7, where he goes on to speak on like what will come of her if she's to stay in the brothel.
Mm.
Um, I think that's after she mocks him, and I think that after she mocks him, he like makes it like an incentive to like bring her down now, to bring her to tears.
Hmm.
Mm.
I think what he's doing with her is what he was trying to do at the dinner party, which is to like manipulate everyone into like worshiping him, like he did to the one friend he had in high school.
Mm.
Um, that's like what he actually succeeds in doing to her for the time being. Like he like doesn't he like bring her to tears?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and so he like just grips her, and then she falls for it. I mean, she's much younger than him, obviously, and she's
Mm.
at a very lowly status, and he puts himself up as this ideal, and
Well,
then
so at this point in his life, he's only about 25, 26. So he's not actually that much older than her. He's only 4 or 5 years older than her.
Yeah.
Um, what I think is interesting though is he calls her a slave girl and then says that he's a free man, which is kind of a contradiction from earlier on where he says that all decent men are slaves and cowards.
Hmm. Yeah, it's true.
I think that was a critique of like the like average morality of people. I don't think that's like his own definition of all decent men. I could
Mm.
be wrong, but I think he's what he would consider decent, whereas everyone else is indecent and immoral.
Mm.
Well, I also could think that saying that he's a free man and she's a slave girl could be kind of like, I guess, yeah, this herd like um, will she lives by, and she just becomes another statistic in a brothel. Um, she just becomes another arbitrary face that can pass away at any moment, and no one will seem to care.
Mm. Um, so here's the quote that I was talking about earlier. So he says, "Man only likes counting his grief. He doesn't count his happiness. But if he were to count properly, he'd see that there's enough of both lots for him." Um, and this is, I believe, after Lisa says the quote about like honest people live good lives even in poverty. Um, and he's kind of talking about how uh, people kind of create their own negative parts of their life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because this is right after he's talking about family and how she would be better off if she had just stayed home, um, how she could be happy. And then she kind of interjects and says, "Well, how do you know? Like, how do you know that my life would be better if I had stayed home?"
Hmm.
Wait, oh, she says that? Oh
Yeah,
yeah, he goes on to say that not all like married women are happy, and like there
exactly.
isn't like ideal family that can be attained. And then he tugs on her emotions with his monologue and convinces her that like yeah, like
Mm,
that something that could be attained. And there's kind of like a hint at he could be the one that gives her that ideal familial utopia.
Mm.
It's
And
like,
he also like in his monologue, he also kind of he admits that with love in like a marriage, then he says if there's love, you can do without happiness too. So
Mm.
it's
hmm,
kind of his he's talking about like I guess more like a consummate form of love, where it's like a dedication to the other, like it's more of like a
Mm.
choice. Um,
Mm.
you'll hear that as like it's like a form of agape love, as opposed to like eros.
Mm.
It's but it I don't know if he's like being. I guess he's genuine. He's romanticizing about like consummate love. He loves that the idea of love,
Mm.
but he's
Well,
unable.
he's a romantic.
Exactly, and he's unable to experience that himself. And he'll, I think he says something like that later, where um, he's talking to her in chapter part 9, where he hates himself for what he's like made her do, or what she's made him do in terms of like admitting all this to himself. Um, but like he's not capable of loving like this, and so it kind of goes into this spiel, which is like it's really nice to hear it, but it's not, you don't know, it's not genuine when it's coming from him. So
Mm.
um, but yeah, you can just see the kind of like the way in which he's pulling on her to like to usurp her, I guess.
Mm. Well,
crazy manipulative.
Yeah. Hmm. And
uh,
James, you're
sorry about that.
muted.
Sorry about that. My phone was going off. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, so it's interesting because in chapter 7 he goes into effectively how she's unloved, how her love is like devalued because she has sold her soul. Um, and then he tells the story of this beaten woman at the Haymarket, and like and effectively goes into how that could be her, and
right.
that at some point she will be sick and her mistress will blame her for not dying quickly enough, which
Yeah.
is a pretty fucked up thing to say to someone.
Well, he says like whenever she mocks him, one of the first thing he says is he says that men see her as like this. Why buy the cow when you get the milk free? Um, Seeing this as like you're giving away the one thing that is like most powerful to you. Um, you give it, and so like, and he says this is the worst insult you could like a girl could receive. So he really like turns, he really turns on her in this part. And it's like the sixth part is more like a kind of like a spiel of love and marriage and family that he gives to her. But then when he sees that she mocks him, he sees it as like, okay, she's trying to hide herself behind this veil of mockery. Now I'm just going to tear her down.
Well,
And
so I don't think he realized that at the time, because I think he actually said that he wishes he had realized it.
where does he say that?
So at the end of chapter 6, I wish I had the exact. Give me a second, and I will find it. Um, because he says that
Oh, you're right.
exactly like you're saying. He says that she was hiding behind her mockery because she's innocent and she doesn't want to reveal that part of herself to him because she
Mhm.
doesn't know him. Um,
Okay, yep, I see. Yeah, because the first thing he says after that is, or in my translation, it says, I did not understand that she was deliberately hiding behind a mask of mockery. Okay.
exactly. Yeah, so he didn't realize it at the time. So I think this is like genuine anger, um, which is why he kind of went into chapter 7, because he
Mhm.
didn't realize that she was being just defensive, not necessarily like mocking him.
Yeah, it's quite just like a long monologue of how he how he like foretells her future, and
Mm.
then actually he hits one spot on, and then where she like breaks down, and he's quite afraid of her, and when he goes to, like, light a candle for the room, he looks at her. And she has like this like twisted smile on her face, and he's kind of freaked out at first, and then it turns out that she comes to embrace him, and she explains to him how she's found this man the other day. I forgot what the event was, but anyway, she'd fallen in love, I guess, with him, and he I guess he made her realize that she had like there was like, or I guess he'd seen that even in her life there was some like significant significant other, I guess you could say, that like
Mm.
made her feel special and not simply um, like not simply just a prostitute.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it was the so she had the letter from the medical student who
Mm-hmm.
she like shows she like treasured the letter,
Mm-hmm.
um, which was interesting because he said that she would treasure it even to the end of her life. Because she said that she would go to him once she paid off her debt. But he had just said, like previously, like you're never gonna pay off your debt. That's just not gonna happen.
Right.
Um, um, and then he like starts to walk home, and I think he did actually walk like through the snow.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he said that he was like very sad about the reality of her existence.
Right.
It just like depressed him.
Now, see, was he when you say that? I'm looking over. Was he sad that he had like? Was he sad that he had found out that like she actually did have a poor existence, or was he sad like resentful to find out that she actually had meaning? I'm trying to remember what
I
it was.
think I think that he was sad because of her existence. Like it's just such a sad thing. Um, let me see if I can't find it. Uh, uh, um, so I think this is it. I wanted so much to leave. I went the whole way on foot, in spite of the wet snow still falling in thick flakes. I was worn out, crushed, perplexed, but the truth was already shining through my perplexity, the nasty truth. So I think he's talking about like the truth of her existence. So
Hmm.
like just how awful her life is.
Okay,
Maybe I'm
Hmm.
misinterpreting that, but I think that's where he's kind of going with that.
I got you. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. Then he goes into the next part. He then becomes like he becomes ashamed of what he done to Lisa, how he like turned her will into his, how he kind of like subjugated her to. Essentially, he'd manipulated her in the way that he originally intended, but he like feels remorse, and he like explains that in this next chapter. Did
Mm.
you guys have any like specific ideas from chapter 8?
Well, he like I'm trying to remember the specifics of it, but he says that he doesn't want her to come visit him, and then I think he dreams that she does. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Um, yeah. That's a dream. I think we touched on it earlier. It was when he kind of romanticized that he would teach her and that she would like become his student
Oh yeah.
and he would save her from her pitiful existence. Um,
Yeah, he's like hopefully I don't get troubled with that, but if I do, then I'll save her, you know.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. He becomes really worrisome of when she'll show up, when she'll um, he starts to regret why he gave his address to her
Mm,
after he left the brothel, and so now he begins like each night he's worried of her visiting, and then when the morning comes, it subsides, only to have it
mm.
happen again the next evening.
Well, and he was worried because he made himself come off as like a hero, and
Right,
he was worried that um she would see just how poor he was and like how bad off he actually was.
right.
It's a gross person. Just like
Uh,
Yeah.
and
Oh
then
man.
I guess from going from chapter 8, because I didn't have too many notes on 8 other than the fact that you
Well,
see like
so
him.
well,
Oh,
so
go ahead.
that's when he so chapter 8 is actually when he went so he wrote a letter to Simonov apologizing for the night before, which I think is a big thing. Um, and he this is also when he gets into kind of the argument with Apollon. He starts he kind of goes into how Apollon has been like very prideful as his servant
Mhm.
and not not doing as much as he should and not doing anything more than he has to, um, and just in his opinion not being a very good servant in general. And so he decides to withhold his wages for 2 weeks,
Right.
um, and then winds up only holding them for like 4 days. And then he
Yeah,
goes into like why that happened. Um,
because Apollon would give him these nasty looks and just
mhm,
stare at him. And then I believe that on the fourth day or the last day, I believe the narrator like, bursts out in anger at Apollon.
mm,
Um, he's asking what he says. It's why are you giving me these looks? What do you want? Um, and yeah, he eventually like submits himself to it because I can't remember the full interaction, but it was pretty comical.
he tried to get Apollon to go get the cops on
yeah,
himself.
That's right.
it was funny. Well, and then he said that I won't give you your wages until you beg me for them. And
Yeah.
then winds up giving him his wages because Lisa came to visit.
Mhm.
And so he needed someone to go get tea for him.
Yeah, immediately you see him go. He begs him to get a tea because he says, you'll ruin the life of a man if you don't. And I guess Apple, even his servant, kind of looks down on him as this crippled man.
Oh man. Yeah, it's it's just a sad existence.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's all I had for chapter 8.
Okay. Yeah, and so I guess chapter part 9 begins with Lisa showing up,
Mm,
um, which is terribly awkward for the narrator and for Lisa because he didn't want her arrival. He didn't want her to appear at all after seeing her in the brothel because he couldn't hide behind the fact that um, she sees his house and sees that he's poverty stricken, uh, and sees his ragtagness, I guess you could say, and he feels ashamed of it.
Yeah, because he had succeeded in convincing her that he was whatever it was that she saw in him, and then she comes and sees him screaming at his servant in poverty. Um, and it's like, and like that's when he like begins to break down, and he just starts sobbing to this prostitute that came to visit him.
Right.
Like that's a great to sum up the whole book. Like that's kind of like you're kind of waiting for his inevitable collapse,
Hmm.
um and then it happens, and then his just this girl's just like rubbing his back like, please calm.
Right. Because
Oh
after
man.
because after his spiel, um, you see Lisa there, who's just she's standing there with like lovingness, and she has true love for him, and he notices this, but even then he still can't accept it, and he has to drive her away because he's incapable of love. In like at the beginning in part 10, he says that loving he describes loving as like tyrannizing and flaunting moral superiority. So he has like a neurotic view of love itself, and he sees it as merely like a power structure more than something exchanged.
Hmm.
Or like ownership almost.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's yeah, it's part 9 is where that was like the most moving part for me, because you see this utter breakdown of him, and you
Mhm.
just see like in his total anger, you see it all inevitably come crashing down, and to have Lisa there still comfort him and to love him, it's it was like it brought him to tears. And then after that moment, he couldn't help but think, what's gonna happen, make of this, what does she think of me now? um like he had such a pridefulness in his like the way people saw him, that he just couldn't get out of that cycle, and so even afterwards he had to drive her away because of his pride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's crazy that he has such like a negative view of love, like as a romantic, and it's weird because he juxtaposes that with like his explanation in part 6, um, where he's very supportive of the idea of love and like the love between a mother and a father and the child.
Yeah,
Um,
he loves the idea of love, but he himself he feels incapable of it.
mm,
It's very it's actually I feel like it's more common than people think, or people like recognize. I feel like a lot of people you'll idealize love.
mm,
Because you idealize it, you feel yourself incapable of living up to that ideal of like what it means to love, and so you're afraid to do it.
mm. I mean that happens with a lot of men. Um, I think Jordan Peterson talks about this. They put women on a pedestal,
Hmm.
um, and then no woman, either A, no woman can live up to that pedestal, or B, um, they you just put them so high above yourself that you can't live up to that, and
Yeah,
and so
becomes like
you kind of
a
bow
jealous.
out early.
Right.
Mhm. Or what happened to like the friendship between the underground man and the kid from high school happens, where like, you submit totally to this other person and they resent you for it.
Mm,
They're like, here, you own me. It's like gross. No,
Right.
like
yeah.
Well, and like that's between like in a relationship between a man and a woman, you don't it isn't necessarily that the man like should assert his will and the woman submits. They both have like their
mhm.
own
Hmm.
their own personalities and their own like or idiosyncratic desires. Um, but however, with like when it comes to a man who just submits entirely to a woman is like a beta, a beta male, and women don't like that. They want, a man to have his own will and to like have his own vision, and to be
Quick
strong.
correction. Healthy women don't want that.
Hell yeah, okay, yeah, hell yeah, and so, and I know it's kind of strange because like the initial relationship you pointed out, Landon, is different because it's between friends. It's like a friendship, um, but which I guess you could say the same thing. You don't want your friend to submit entirely to you because they're not really a friend. Because in friendship, you kind of like respect the differences and like your own like what someone else desires. Um, so yeah, I don't know. In this guy, in the narrator, there's a lot of like neuroses and like a lot of uh, problems surrounding how he interacts in relationships, and so his relationship to love and to like how how relationships, romantic or not, how you're supposed to interact in them. They're very skewed and they're very um, damaging. And I mean, that's why he's where he's at. That's why he's in the position that he's in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think that's kind of what Dostoevsky was getting at when he had the underground man say, when he goes and speaks to whatever the guy's name was, when he was talking about going and confronting all of humanity, is he's so segregated into his own corner where any interaction with another human is an interaction with humanity. So at that point, like it doesn't matter who he's interacting with. He's put any person into a box of like the abstracted reality of what it means to be human. He's not seeing the person. He's seeing his conception of what a person is, and himself is above that.
Interesting.
That is an interesting way of thinking about it. Oh man.
So I guess after, well, yeah, I guess after part 9, you see him. You like you're. It begins with well, it doesn't begin with, but you've just seen the narrator who was being consoled by Lisa get up and run to the corner of the room, and she feels incredibly awkward, and like he like pushes her out the door by like making her feel even more awkward, and then once she runs out the door, she never comes back. However, the narrator, he realizes what a mistake he's made in terms of he had someone who actually loved him, and so he wants to go and reconcile with her. Only she doesn't return. But even in chasing after her, he begins questioning himself. It's like, why am I doing this? Like, what's going to come of this? So, like, his intellect continually overpowers his instincts. He has no, like, he has no emotional grounding, or he doesn't give emotions their like power in themselves. He thinks that like he can monitor everything through his smarts.
Yeah, I thought it was funny that like when he was urging her out of the room, he puts money in her hand, and then she like throws it on the table as she's leaving. Like that was like so psychologically telling. As he's weeping and like and complaining about the fact that she saw him in his impoverished state, but then puts money in her hand. It's like he's completely like I don't know how to even describe it, but it's incredibly like immature. Like he thinks of himself as like this prime intellect, but he has like no understanding of how people see him.
Right.
Like completely unable to understand how his actions are being perceived, and by what he's and about like what he's saying, how that like enacts on another person. It's pretty, like, I think that's the reason Dostoevsky makes that apparent is because it shows kind of like what happens when someone like in like solitary confinement, almost like what that does to someone.
Mm.
It's interesting.
Yeah, you can almost say that was like a Nietzsche.
Yeah,
He lived
that,
in pretty much solitary confinement.
yeah, and like that's great for like I don't know. I think I was listening to Twilight of the Idols on audiobook. I just wanted to listen to a little bit to see if it was something I'd be interested in reading. And I forget the exact quote, but it was from Socrates, how you either have to be a god or an animal to live in confinement. It was like I was like fucking deep, like and I think he's closer to an animal.
Mm.
Yeah, the the duality of that is very interesting,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
because on the one hand you have the God who's ascetic, much like Christ who can fast in the desert. You know, someone who's extremely ascetic like that, they can either come back with higher wisdom. They can truly develop themselves in confinement, or you can I don't want to I wouldn't say degenerate. I don't want to say degenerate because I don't think the animal part is what that represents. I think the animal just means that your consciousness is just lower, and your like the fact that you're alone doesn't really bother you. You just live like an animal. You just live naturally, I guess.
But
Right.
it kind of implies that you're not in control
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
in a
that
way.
aesthetic endeavor involves any it involves chastity, and it involves not eating, like you said, like fasting, which are like more primitive, like we think of those as like animal tendencies. That's what we have in common with animals.
Mm.
And so like to be a god and to transcend that, like that entails anything that involves your like more carnal attributes, is you like look down on that and you go like, I'm higher than that, and he clearly isn't incapable of that.
Mm. Mm.
So we kind of we coming back to the last part, we talked about the cheap happiness and noble suffering. Uh, but he says that we all silently agree that it's much better according to books, um, while like our everyday lives are mundane, and like laborious.
Mm.
We like escape in books. Um, so I took that as meaning that people nowadays fail to find like a holistic meaning in their lives, and because they see their everyday life as being mundane, as being boring and arduous, whereas if an imagination, uh, it finds its home in books, and you kind of escape into them, but they don't really have their place in the real world. I guess you could say they're just imagination.
Well, and
Uh,
you kind of see that with like when Nietzsche was talking about with the Apollonian. So the idea with the Apollonian is you build up the individual, which is kind of what you do when you're reading books. I mean, you're reading the story of a hero that's building himself up, and then what you do is take those ideas and pull them out and try and apply them to your own life,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a way to bring that imaginative wonder into your own life, so that it's not so mundane.
right.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of that quote would be that, like, if this was written now, I think books would be replaced with TV, and the underground man wouldn't be like he wouldn't be sitting there reading. He'd just be laying on his couch watching TV all the time. Just um, as opposed to like reading like a novel where you just
Or social media.
yeah, social media too, where it's just that search for entertainment that in a lot of ways negates life. Where like life should be the thing entertaining you if you set it up right to be maximally challenging, and you're finding aspects in it that promote growth. But a lot of people just um, say fuck that, and they play video games, watch TV, and browse Instagram all the time. And in that way, Dostoevsky kind of foretold the future, where uh, like I don't know, like without like fundamentally looking at life in a redeeming way, you fall into that pit of meaningless, whatever you want to call that, meaningless entertainment.
Well, it's like the problem of the Alexandrian man that Nietzsche talks about. When you become so embedded in like knowledge and rationality, you kind of like lose the ability to make great art, and
Mhm.
your perception of the world becomes like reductionist, um, and just the quality of your everyday life, like how you go about your life, diminishes so much because again you're living in a world that tries to put a box around everything, and you're living in a world that doesn't give itself to imagination, and so you have to like you even when you find it in like entertainment, it's only like those imaginations are just for entertainment. Like, okay, that's interesting, that's cool, but that doesn't apply to the real world. So
Mhm. Yeah, like this thing is just, you can read, it's such a short book, but there's so much in there that you can extract out if you pay close attention, which is why I love the reading a book with you guys, because it forces you to take just suck everything out of the book, and to talk about it afterwards. Draws connections that you wouldn't make otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find
Awesome.
that I miss a lot in these books that you guys kind of pick up.
Oh yeah, you two point shit out that I had, like I just skimmed over, and then I go, oh wow, like yeah, it's awesome.
yeah, groups, yeah, reading your reading group definitely helps with these. Um, he says he writes that he says without books we instantly become confused and lost. It's as though it's because we lack this like fulfilled experience of life that we couldn't find our own way um, without books.
Hmm.
Like, which I mean, I kind of agree with, but I disagree with as well. Like, I can see both ways of it. I agree that uh, it's like how else do you transfer information, and how else are idea like how else are ideas of myth transposed through cultures through books. But I think it also could be a play at just the fact that we need intellectual material to help us to digest life instead of interacting with life itself, and getting out in the world and doing stuff.
I mean, it's kind of the idea of religion, right? So if you have a very mundane life and you don't see the point in your life, and everything is just kind of bad, I mean, you want something that's going to be there to tell you, hey, everything's okay. There's like some greater purpose to your life. And that's books kind of serve the same purpose there. They kind of tell you everything, maybe not necessarily that everything's going to be okay, but there is a greater purpose to your life. At least like most fiction books, you're not going to see many fiction books that don't leave you with like some kind of hero's journey.
Well,
Yeah,
it's interesting because like we think of like needing this like an intellectual job to do, but like when you know how there's like like tribes that they're just now finding that are still in like this stone. Like all they do is like hunt food
Mhm.
and live in a tribal community. Like, are those people more or less content with life than we are, leading what we would consider an animalistic life, or are they completely content and they go like, no, I have my job and I have my family. Um, Gathering food and playing with my children is all I really need.
Mm.
Like, or
Well,
are they
it's
intellectually like they have this huge gap that needs filled? And if you gave them a pile of books and taught them how to read, they would thank you and like kiss your feet, kind of thing.
it's funny that you say that because ironically, I just watched. Uh, you're gonna laugh at this. I just watched Pocahontas last night,
Hmm.
and that was like a big theme in that was he called her a savage because she was not civilized. Um, and she was like, "No, I'm not a savage. I'm just different than you.
Right.
I enjoy my life. I'm at one with nature. I'm much more in tune with nature than you are, and I enjoy that much more than I would being in like society where, well, I mean, you're in society if you're like with that because there's still people there, but like civilized society, um, where you're much more cut off from nature.
Hmm.
Um, and that was a big point of contention was like calling people savages because they're not necessarily like the prim and proper English way of existing.
Wow.
That's so funny, man. Like, I don't know. Like, like we have, like, we're just like, well, because I mean, you see this um, with diet and with exercise. Like the reason that that's conducive to mental health is because it's closer to the way our physiology is programmed.
Mm,
Where like like a hunter gatherer will walk for miles and then find some kind of berry and then eat that berry, and then that's all the guy needed, you know.
mm,
But we have all this stuff, but we're riddled with anxiety, depression, low levels of PTSD with the majority, and heightened cortisol levels, and all this bullshit because um, we're not equipped to deal with what we've created. And then the solution to that is to get down to basics.
mm.
Go walk around in nature, go for a hike, run a little bit, lift weights. It's interesting, man.
Mhm.
Definitely. I mean, it's. I mean I think that's what most people are lacking nowadays is they've worked these. I mean, not everyone, because a lot of people don't really work what I would call like high intelligence jobs, um, or like high stress, like mental stress jobs. Um, but people that do, I mean, that can be more stressful than like a physically stressful job. It often is actually. Um,
Hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, like bodily stress as opposed to intellectual stress. The bodily stress is healthy. Well, the intellectual stress, man, that leads to physical diseases.
mm,
It's
Well,
wow.
psychological or physiological stress, they manifest both the same way in the body. It's just a matter of well, there's two concepts of stress. There's distress and there's eustress. Because you can have positive stress responses to certain events in your life where, say, you're like excited for a new job and you're about to start it, so that's a positive stress response. But it's a matter of minimizing distress, so negative stress, and mm, also mitigating stress so that way it doesn't become chronic. So like you said, intellectual stress can typically be more stressful than physical stress. Um,
mm,
and so if you have that constant demand of that job where it's continually stressing you out, that can lead to chronic stress, which leads to like a myriad of pathologies in the body.
Hmm.
And it's the same way with like if you had to like, you know, run 30 miles a day every day. Like that's going to lead to chronic levels of stress. They're both stressors, just one's physical and one's psychological.
Yeah, well, physical stress just results in an increase of muscle and prolonged health because you're exerting physically. That's crazy.
There's always a balance because you can you can overwork yourself.
Yeah, that's true.
It's pretty hard. Like we're kind of equipped to, like our ancestors like sprinted after deer and just jogged, like tracking them until the deer died. Like we're equipped to take on some pretty intense physical stress.
Well, it isn't necessarily the training itself that leads you to become overtrained. It's a lot harder for us nowadays to recover, based on like our dieting patterns, and also due to our inability to recover. We don't sleep as properly as we should. We're like in EMF environments all the time. We're not grounded to the earth. We don't get as much sun exposure as we should. So like it's harder to recover in that sense, and that's where the overtraining can come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess what we're getting at, going back to the book, is he's doing neither of these stresses.
Right. Well, yeah, it's just you. For him, it's like he's so intellectual and he's out of his body. He doesn't experience life. He tries to think through life.
Mm-hmm.
And so without books, that's why he's saying without books, you can never find your own way.
Yeah, the books are his only what would you even call that? I guess his only censor of he's just like sitting there and just like clenching his brain and then hoping that it turns into some kind of diamond. But it's just coal, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Just stress. That's it.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any other notes?
I didn't have anything else. I think.
How many hours has it?
We have been going for just over 2 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess there's a quote that is my last note. It kind of ties in with what we were just talking about. He says that we even feel it's too much of a burden to be men with real bodies, real blood of our own. So
Well, there you go.
Yeah, I guess that's a happy note to end it on.
Light stuff is
usual. Yeah, we'll try and make sure that we do something lighthearted next time. But yeah, so that's all I had. Do you guys have any kind of like wrap up notes? Any summaries? Anything like that?
I'm just going to get out from underground, go live my life a little bit more so as to avoid being him when I'm 26.
It's also like it challenges oneself to question your motives. Why do you want to be in this position? Why do you want to be recognized as being smarter than others? Because if you're coming from a place like this man, then you'll only spiral downwards. There's no beneficence upon his part. There's no he's not doing this for the sake of becoming more noble and becoming like a better human being. He's resentful more than anything. And it's a good psychological insight to how someone like this develops.
Yeah, well said.
I would also say learn to let thoughts pass. Like don't give credence to every single thought because you will go insane. There's a lot of thoughts that you just need to let go. Cool. Well, I think with that we're gonna go ahead and call it a day. So I hope you have if I could speak. Hope you guys have a great day. Bye.
Yeah.